Lovely to have you all here in the flesh.
Hi, I'm Ashlyn McGee from The Conversation, and this is our daily news conference.
Basically, there are only about 4 experts in the country that actually model how much it costs to raise a child. They're few and far.
This is where our experienced team of journalists pitches ideas about what's going on in the world, the latest research developments, or stories that just help you make sense of breaking news. We then hit the phones and keyboards, commissioning academic experts to share their knowledge in stories that are free to read and free to republish. Please consider becoming a monthly donor and support our work. Go to the link in our show notes, donate.theconversation.com, and support a healthier democracy.
From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
The Albanese government this week released its National Climate Risk Assessment. This report details a shocking picture of the impact of climate change into the 2090s, revealing that heat-related deaths would soar, flooding would increase dramatically, and rising sea levels would devastate some coastal areas. But the assessment has received a mixed reception, with some critics saying it exaggerates some of the likely outcomes. The government is also about to announce its 2035 target for emissions reduction, with various stakeholders having argued strongly for different levels of ambition. To discuss the climate report, the imminent announcement of the 2035 emissions reduction target, and the argument within the opposition over its commitment to net zero by 2050, we're joined today by the Grattan Institute's Senior Fellow for Energy and Climate Change, Tony Wood. Tony Wood, the National Climate Risk Assessment details predictions right up until 2090. But given how hard it can be to predict the future, how much credibility can we put on those sorts of assessments?
I guess the question is, if you want to use these as a forecast of what's going to happen in 2090, then I wouldn't. But if you were trying to use this as a way of understanding how our world could unfold, not just Australia, but the world unfold under climate change if we don't seriously do something about it, then it provides, I think, a powerful way of looking at this, is giving you some substantial reasons as to how we have to understand what needs to be done and the consequences, not specific ones, but the broad consequences of what will happen in Australia and to the world if we don't. And of course, in Australia, many of the people who live in certain parts of the country are already seeing the consequences of what's been described in this report. So it's a very important report, but I don't think we should take it as a specific forecast, because if we do, then I think it'll obviously be wrong. But the value is not in how precise it is. The value is painting that broad picture of how challenging this future would be if we don't do something about it.
So in broad terms, you think that the report has got the situation about right, or do you think it is somewhat exaggerated?
I don't think it's exaggerated. And the trick with these things is that you can come up with assumptions in these things, as we all do. And what you're trying to do is not forecast the future, but test the what happens if certain assumptions play out in ways that you might not like. And this is what this is doing, which is quite valuable. Therefore, I don't think it's catastrophizing. It's simply saying, look, if you keep doing this, you're going to be in trouble. And we all do this in our own private lives as well, right? We should learn from that. If you keep eating this way, you're going to have a heart attack. Or if you keep smoking, you're going to die from lung cancer, right? That's what this is about.
How much is new in this report, or does it consolidate what we already knew?
This is the first comprehensive economy-wide report we've seen. And I was involved in the Garneau Climate Change Review in 2008, and it did a similar sort of thing. But this is the first time it's been brought together. We've seen snapshots before. It doesn't really paint the financial and economic consequences of what's been talked about as much as I would have liked. But I think it is a very valuable piece of work, and it would be important from now on that it gets updated, because when you are looking at the future, we'll see this play out in real life. And the question is then to say, okay, in 5 years' time, How are we going against this? Is it looking any better? Is it looking any worse? Those sorts of questions. And it gives you a benchmark against which to measure progress.
Just on the financial consequences, there are big figures in the report about the costs of not adequately addressing the issues. But I note that some economists challenge these because they say, well, things adapt. If bad things are happening in certain areas, adaptation takes place.
Look, that's true. I guess what this is also doing, Michelle, it's a very important point that we have to do two things. And we've always had to do this, but this report puts it in context. Not only do we have to reduce emissions, but we already know that climate change itself is already happening to the point that certain things are already locked in, if you like. And so we're going to have to adapt to a level of climate change anyway. Now, of course, we'll find ways to deal with that. But I think that's why I don't think you should take this report as a forecast of what's going to happen. It's a warning of what could happen. Now, that means that therefore we need to be prepared. We need to be adapting, and we need to make sure that things don't turn out to be as bad as this analysis shows they could be. In some ways, that's the point of the analysis. It's not to say this is going to happen. It's basically to say, look, this is what we need to respond to, and we can do it better. This is why the government will be taking action when it announces what its policies are going to be.
The report's been deliberately timed just before the government announces its 2035 emissions reduction target. To what extent do you think the report is political, and has that taken away a bit from its credibility?
It will be used in different ways, and where this is all happening in a week when the opposition is itself debating what's it going to do about climate change. I think the issue for me is, look, I think this report is based upon the best interpretation of the science that we're likely to see and have seen. However, that's where so what the government now does will be based upon the science, but of course, when they announce the targets, that will also be based upon the politics. And so this report provides a science-based view of what the world could look like and what we need, and sharpens up what we need to do. But that inevitably, as you and I know, politics always trumps, policy and science. So in the short term, of course, the government will be looking at this through the lens of politics, but looking at something which is based on science.
Well, we are about to get this 2035 target, and we think it'll probably be a band rather than just a single figure. The speculation is that it will be somewhere within the broad range of 60% emissions reduction to 75% emissions reduction. Now, that's a very big range, but can you just walk us through the implications of a position at the low end of that range and at the high end?
Yeah, I guess it is quite a challenging question to think about how you do this. At the low end, if we were to go from where we have been and are heading more or less, we've got to be in pretty close to 60% anyway. We're probably heading right now towards something about 50%, and so we're going to have to step up the pace, and quite considerably, as it turns out, because some of the stuff we've done so far, even though we've made good progress, has done some of the easy yards. The hard yards are still ahead. So that's why even 60%, whilst it may not be considered enough by the environmental groups in this debate, it is certainly not going to be lacking in ambition in terms of achievability. Many of the environmental groups would argue that to seriously address climate change, countries like Australia need to be doing 100% by 2035. And I think the Climate Change Authority, going back almost 12 months now, indicated that they thought somewhere between 65 and 75 would be about right, but not long after that, the consequences or the implications of the Trump administration and what it's been doing to winding back American action on climate change and therefore global action on climate change has been quite significant. And so you can see how that upper range is probably not going to be more than that. Now, I don't think the government itself will announce a range as broad as 60 to 75, but if it's less than 60, I think it'll be hard to see how that's got environmental credibility. And if it's more than 75, it's hard to see it's got economic credibility. And so they're the two bookends for this debate. And lots of organisations now have given the government advice on what they should do. And I think, even whether they announce a range or not, I think there's a benefit in having a range because it gives government some flexibility for the things we don't know, and also tends to avoid the unseemly discussion in that if the government falls short of any target by a very small amount, it's considered to be a failure, whereas in fact, where we are now, we've actually been making a lot of progress.
Just to clarify, if it announced a band, it would obviously be a fairly narrow band, right, between a band of about 5 points.
Yeah, look, the Abbott government had a band of 2 points from 26 to 28. What's important isn't the width of the band so much, is if the government said, look, we're going to have a band of, let's say, 60 to 65. We're going to commit to 60, but we're also going to say as things unfold over the next several years, because remember, this is 10 years away we're talking about, a lot will change. As those things change, we may find that the necessity to increase our ambition becomes more clear, and we also may find that the costs of doing so become more clear, and therefore we could increase our commitment. So it could be, for example, that we review this target every couple of years and say, right, we started at 60, now we're pretty confident we can get to 63 and maybe we get to 65. And so you can see the benefit of having a range, that you can use it much more dynamically to respond to the things that we simply do not know today.
If the band was in the 70s, what sort of implication would that have for sectors like agriculture, transport?
But there's some sectors of our economy that are very hard to decarbonise because the technologies are still relatively undeveloped. And overall across, we've been, our emissions have not been coming down over the last 4 or 5 years. There's a suggestion they could be coming down just a little bit in the last few months. So the rate of emissions reduction, which is currently about 10 million tonnes a year at best, would have to be, from 2030 to 2035, would have to be about 3 times that. Now, that is very challenging across the whole economy. When you look at electricity, which has done most of the heavy lifting, it will have just about got close to net zero anyway by 2035. And so then you're looking at things like heavy industry, transport, and agriculture, and they all have very significant technical and technology challenges. And so the important issue then is, if we are going to commit the targets in the higher end of whatever range the government's talking about, be it 65, 70 or 75, we have to have clear policies of how the hell are we going to get there, because right now, even though we've got a policy for light vehicles called the New Vehicle Efficiency Standard, that only applies to personal cars and small commercial vehicles. Heavy transport is a big deal. Agriculture is very difficult because 2/3 of the emissions, if not more, come from burping and farting cows and sheep. And so you can see in heavy industry, where you've got things like steel manufacturing and aluminum manufacturing, we still don't have clear pathways on technology. So there's some very big barriers in those areas which have to be confronted if we are going to seriously go after targets above the 65 range.
The government, of course, has made climate change and emissions reduction a priority, and yet, as you say, very little progress seems to be currently being made on emissions falling. Why is that?
Look, part of it, there's two or three things. One is that we've had a climate war now for many, many years in this country. We're not the worst in the world, but we're certainly not the best. And unfortunately, when we have got close to getting clarity and even bipartisan agreement, it's all fallen apart. I mean, we got close to that, a little close to that with John Howard. We got close with Kevin Rudd. We got close with Malcolm Turnbull, and it all fell apart each time. And unfortunately, that means that unless you have a government who's prepared to be very committed and very clear and embrace, for example, an economy-wide approach to this, is much harder to do when you start to break it up. So the politics have trumped policy all the way through, and that is not a very nice place to be if you're trying to make progress on something like this. And of course, we still don't have bipartisan commitment, because when investors look at this, even though they might not have taken the coalition's policy commitments to the 2025 election seriously, they're always going to be saying, well, how do we deal with the uncertainty that the politics creates here? So I think the difficulty has been that, look, we made a lot of progress on land use clearing. We made reasonably good progress on electricity because we had a policy going right back to 2002 that was introduced by John Howard. It was then reinforced by Kevin Rudd. Deals were done between Malcolm Turnbull the then opposition, I can't remember who it was now, and then more recently we've seen the current government step it up a bit and use, interestingly, a policy called direct action and the safeguard mechanism, which was designed by Greg Hunt when he was minister he was in opposition back in 2010, was implemented under the Abbott government. So, the things that tend to survive are the ones that get bipartisan support. And that's why this has been hard, because getting bipartisan support has been very difficult. Now, industry's on board and with a lot of this, and I think that makes a big difference.
So you think that the so-called climate wars are the main reason why we can't get emissions down at the moment?
Well, I think that plus, in the vein of that climate war, governments, and this is where I think Labor has been partly contributing in its own way, and that is by giving people the impression this was all going to be cheap and easy, that renewables were going to bring down the cost of electricity. And the lived experience has been that electricity prices have not gone down. Now, that's not due to action on climate change, but in that world, you can see how that gets interpreted that way. And so I think for example, the progress we had hoped to make, or the government had hoped to make when it was elected in 2022, I don't think we're on track to achieve those objectives, partly because we had the war in Ukraine, partly because we had weather patterns which developed, unfortunately, in 2022 and 23, partly because the old coal-fired power stations are getting less reliable, and partly because everything is turning out to be more expensive and taking longer than people might have hoped. That's just the real world. But that's the world in which we now live.
So if we're talking about the 2030 target of 43% reduction, how's that progressing? Do you think we're going to miss that target? And of course, there's another target, and that's that by that time there will be 82% renewables in the system.
I think the overall emissions reduction of 43% below 2005 levels by 2030 is legislated. It partly depends upon achieving 82% renewables, and they're obviously related. So one of the biggest contributors to reducing emissions has been the introduction of and the support for renewable energy in electricity. So when you look at the numbers, we've gone in renewables, for example, specifically a target to which the current government was very committed, the 82%. We were about 10% renewables back when this whole thing started in 2005. We're now about 40%. So we've made significant progress. But we've got to more than double that to get to 82% by 2030. And we're not really on track because it's turned out to be much harder in terms of costs, much harder in terms of social license, much harder in terms of regulatory approvals. But if we instead of getting to 82, if we got to 70% renewable by 2030, that would be very significant progress from where we've come and set ourselves up to make more progress. So we'll get to 82, it just may not be in 2030. And that means also we may get to 38 to 40% emissions reductions by 2030. We'll get to 43 and 45, but may not be 2030. And I don't consider that to be a failure, Michelle. I think that to be enormous progress, and we continue to set targets and do everything we can to meet those targets. And it won't be the targets that the government announced tomorrow, which was so important. The important thing is going to be what they say about how we're going to achieve those targets.
Now, the Liberals, as I think you've mentioned, are having this big debate about whether they stick with net zero. If they don't, what are the implications for investment and for the transition generally, even if they're not in power?
Well, partly I think the lived evidence of this was I don't think many people in the industry at all took the nuclear idea seriously at all. Industry was pretty well silent on that in terms of anyone seriously thinking about building a nuclear power station in Australia. And I think the idea that was taken to the electorate in May this year is pretty well dead anyway. To the time, if there was to be a change of government down the track in 3 years or 6 years' time, so much of what will have happened by then will make it impossible really to do some of the stuff that the opposition was talking about. However, it could be still that where Ted O'Brien began his journey on nuclear in terms of small modular nuclear reactors, that could still turn out to be feasible. And Australia should play a watching brief and see how that world unfolds, because maybe they will have a role to play in our future. But right now, I think the sort of position the opposition's in is challenging on its own behalf. That's very much your political world more than mine in terms of policy. But I don't think right now industry is concerned about what the opposition is going to do at all, to be honest. Now, of course, that can change quite quickly.
Well, of course, nuclear was seen by the opposition or portrayed by the opposition as helping down the road to net zero. But now, whatever they do with nuclear, they seem to be, or at least many of them, set to ditch net zero, certainly the Nationals. Will that really scare investors even more?
Look, I think if they say, for example, the compromise, and the Liberals had a history of eventually compromising to save themselves. Let's say they said, look, we're going to aim for net zero by 2060 instead of 2050, right? Now, what's important then is what they talked about before the last election. To get nuclear in place, they had to say, we're going to begin the journey towards nuclear. Because that's going to take a long time, we're going to have to keep coal open longer, use more gas, and we're going to have to slow down renewables. They're the things that start to spook people now, because these aren't things that are going to happen in 2040 and 2050. These things are going to happen in the early 2030s. And so it isn't going to be what target, if they do compromise on a new target, the opposition agrees on. It's going to be, what does that mean for policy now? And that's where, what we do know is that keeping coal running longer is going to become impossible. And right now in Victoria, the Yallourn Power Station continues to have major failure problems because it's getting old, Michelle. I mean, most of us eventually start to break down as we get older. And that's what's actually literally happening. And keeping those things running longer will be impossible. So they're still going to have not just this target, but once they've done that, then people like Dan Tehan and so forth will have to turn that into, okay, what does that mean for the policy we're going to take to the next election and the one after that? Because pretty clearly, the nuclear power stations that were not going to arrive until 2037 was not going to do much about a cost of living election in 2025.
And just finally, do you get the feeling that the whole international action on climate change is stalling? Donald Trump's opted out of Paris. Big emitters don't seem to be making very fast progress. Has this issue really fallen into something of an international heap?
I think to some extent it has right now, globally and in Australia. I think geopolitics, concerns about economics and the cost of living and so forth have pushed it down the ladder in terms of its priority. And clearly what Trump's been doing has turned away a lot of renewable energy projects, shut down ones that were almost finished. And that's had an impact flowing through to Australia in terms of wind energy and so forth. Now, it could still mean that some of those investors, if they can find some confidence to invest in Australia, will come here rather than the US. That could be good for us. But of course, the reality is that climate change is not going to go away. And so things like the report we referred to at the beginning of this conversation about the climate risks, those climate risks will be there regardless of what Donald Trump does. So it is going to be, right now, I think it's a difficult position to be in. I don't think I see many of the other countries of the world reducing their commitment. If anything, for example, it seems like the Chinese government remains very committed to their net zero by 2060, and they're doing things in that direction, looking to close coal and replace it with renewables the same way we are. India will be a very important player here, of course. But, all those other countries that are still taking action on climate change, it is also true that some of those things which were looking to be the answer were a little bit ambitious. Things like, well, we're going to use hydrogen for a whole lot of things. It's turned out to be a bit more expensive than people are yet prepared to pay. So there's a long way to go. And I think the Australian position very much mirrors the global position in terms of, for many people, climate change becoming less of an issue, and getting that back onto the agenda is going to be important. And unfortunately, I hope it's not another season of big bushfires or terrible floods and so forth. That would be not the way to bring this back onto the agenda.
Tony Wood, thank you very much for being with us in this big week for climate policy. That's all for today's Conversation podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.